Sir Porritt, I heard you in the morning session. You are a very powerful speaker, and I thought amongst all the other speakers, you were one of those very few people who could say what needed to be said. So there was something very striking in a certain observation by you, and you said that the governments across the world, whether dictators or democracies, they all seem to be working in the same way. So how is that? I mean, why is everyone seems everyone seems to be mesmerized?
It's an extraordinary moment in human history, because if you go back to the start of civilization, really, both in the West and in the East, science has always been a critical part of those human journeys. Right now, in this moment of time, we are denying science as the foundation for our civilization, because the science tells us that our current model of progress and growth can't be sustained. Just can't be sustained with 9 billion people all wanting to live the life of a rich Californian. It's just not possible. So the science is absolutely incontrovertible, and yet our politicians the world over are setting that science aside and continuing with a model of progress that cannot possibly serve us well. So this is a very tough moment, because we need to go back to an understanding that all good societies are built on a proper understanding of two things. One, the scientific principles on which wealth can be created, and secondly, the need to treat each other empathetically, compassionately, ethically, as a critical core component part of any society. At the moment, both of those two things are absent in politics.
Right. I think the way you defined it was that the governments have failed us in the most extraordinary manner, and it has been the case with the corporate world as well as the civil society. I thought the civil society would have been different.
So my point this morning was to demonstrate that we are seeing a lot of dynamic change in the balance between government, civil society and business. This is the triangle of governance, if you like, for sustainability. As I've said, governments are not doing very well. Civil society is extremely focused on equity issues, on environmental issues, human rights. There's a strong impulse to try and put right the things that are going wrong. The interesting story is what's happening in business, because historically business was not helping the sustainability cause. Much of what it did worked against both the interests of communities and human society and the environment. In the last 10 years, business has transformed many of its attitudes about sustainability. And the leading companies today, I don't mean all companies, but the leading companies are bringing forward innovative new ideas, a more values-based approach to wealth creation, thinking long-term, not short-term, and genuinely making a contribution to a more sustainable world. So that's where the real change is happening, and I was keen to recognize the contribution of business, but keen to remind business people that it's governments that need to mandate things, and it's civil society that gives business the license to operate. Without that license to operate, business has no legitimacy in society at all.
Right. So does it also mean to say that you would rather have governments which are more accountable to people and which do not give away the mandate to the businesses, their own mandate of governance?
For me, it's clear that governments essentially hold that authority. This is in a democracy, in India, in the UK. Governments hold that authority from the electorate to shape markets and create a legislative framework which then obliges business to behave in a certain way. All our countries have huge numbers of environmental laws of one kind or another. Most of them are not imposed properly, they're not enforced. Business is able to get away with a huge amount. There's no real level playing field here, and there's a lot of corruption in the system. So at the moment, governments are failing to use the mandate from the people to bring forward accountable, rigorous, democratic systems to create wealth more sustainably. That's the problem. I think people want this. I think actually business would respond positively to clearer market signals about sustainability, and the missing element is the government element.
Right. You seem to place a lot of the, if I may say so, the fault on the governments, or rather governance. But between the various centers of power in the world, let's say the Americans, the Chinese, the Europeans, and to some extent India, which ones do you think are more serious about tackling climate change and bringing in sustainable development?
That's interesting. I think it's fair to say that the European countries have still got some real leadership in that regard. We heard a very interesting presentation this morning at the summit from a representative from Denmark, from Copenhagen, and you could see there in that model just how progressive good governance in a northern European country can be. And our Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, are very progressive on this agenda, and that helps the whole of the rest of Europe to be good. The story in America is much more disappointing. Barack Obama has been a huge disappointment to people the world over in terms of his failure to lead on climate change. He barely mentioned it in the first 4 years of his administration. We're now excited that he's actually mentioned it in his inauguration speech. Well, good, but is he going to do anything serious about it? India is not a leading country when it comes to climate change and sustainability. It's got some good things to show, but it does not take a lead with this. It allows business to act in very destructive ways on the natural environment in terms of resources, land, and the climate story is a bad story in India. We have to be honest. India's got fantastic renewable energy resources. It's got its solar mission now. It's got an ambitious target on renewable energy generation, but it's still anticipating a huge increase in the amount of coal-fired power for the country. And that's going to be very problematic. And that just leaves China. And you'll be surprised to hear that I actually think China is doing a lot more than people understand on these issues. It is interesting to reflect on the fact that the leadership in China is made up of just 9 people, or even, I think it may even be fewer now, all of whom have a scientific or engineering background. And I come back to my point I started with. You can't set aside empirical foundations to good governance. And in China, they have understood the physics of climate change. Nobody in China will debate with you about the science of climate change. It's not a debate. It's not a debate. It's happening. They know it's happening. They will debate with you about the politics and the economics of climate change and how best to address it, but it's not, the science is not an issue. So my hint is I would watch out for what will happen with China, because I think they could take a very interesting role in promoting better governance on climate issues around the world.
Right. So if you would want India to take the lead, or at least to begin somewhere, what would be a couple of messages that you would like to share with us?
India has a phenomenal natural resource base. It is blessed with incredibly fertile land, with wonderful forests. Yes, it has its share of scarcity issues with water and so on, but it is fantastic natural resources. And for me, I would love to see India seize hold of this solar mission and its renewable energy targets and quadruple them, magnify them by 10. Because India could be sourcing far more of the energy it needs from renewables. That's the first thing. The second thing is energy efficiency. Even if you're generating all your energy from low carbon sources, you still have to use it very efficiently. Vast amounts of energy are wasted in India. The grid system is very inefficient. Buildings are not being built to the highest standards. Huge amounts of energy are wasted with unnecessary air conditioning in big cities. So there's lots that can be done on the efficiency story as well as on the renewable energy story. And the last challenge would be on water. And we know that water is a massive problem for many cities in India already. It's a big issue when it comes to agriculture, to industry, for domestic purposes. The Indian government still finds that it has to subsidize water and subsidize electricity. It would be better to introduce some market disciplines into this and gradually introduce pricing mechanisms so that you phased out the subsidies and persuaded people to use water far more intelligently by pricing it properly, at a very low level to begin with, and certainly not damaging the interests of poor people, but making sure that water is valued as a critical component of any sustainable economy.
Sir Porritt, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You have radically divergent views, but they seem to be loaded with solutions. It's nice speaking to you. Thank you for your time.
Pleasure.